In this video, we will show you how to replace your fuel tank on this Toyota Camry. This will be mounted under your vehicle. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Since we're going to be dealing with fuel-related items, we want to make sure that we release fuel pressure from inside of the system. To do that, we'll make our way along the driver's side of the engine compartment, right alongside of the battery. We're going to dislodge this cover from the fuse box. There's a small locking tab on the front there. You can just pull that away as well. Now we'll be looking at the legend in this area. We're looking right about where my thumb is here. You can see a 15 amp fuse and it says EFI, electronic fuel injection. We're going to remove that from the fuse compartment. You can use some small pliers for this. We'll just take hold of it, give it a little tug up and out. A quick inspection and we'll set it aside temporarily.
The next thing you have to do is hop inside the passenger compartment. You're going to attempt to start the vehicle. What you may find is it starts and stalls out. Otherwise, it might just keep on cranking. Crank, crank, crank. Either way, that's what we're looking for. At that point, we've evacuated the fuel pressure from the system and we can continue.
Now that we've released fuel pressure from in the system, let's reattach our 15 amp fuse into the original position. We'll press it in, listen for a click. Protect that area with its cover. Continue on to your negative battery terminal. We'll use a 12mm on the mounting nut here. We'll turn that just enough times that we can remove the terminal end from the battery. A quick inspection and set it aside so it's making no contact. Let's make our way inside the rear of the passenger compartment. We're going to remove the rear seat. To do this, you should be able to just take hold of it and give it a light tug up. I got one side there. Now we'll slide this right out of place. With the seat out of the way, we'll be paying attention in this area. You're going to find a trap door with a wiring harness leading through it. Before we start removing any of the hardware holding this down, let's make our way to the center rubber plug. Go ahead and take hold of that, and we'll just gently dislodge this. After that's dislodged from the shield itself, we'll continue on with a Phillips head screwdriver to remove all of the hardware. My application has 3 mounting screws. We'll take these right out of here. Last one in this corner. Now we can remove the shield, but before we do, we'll just go ahead and take this rubber grommet and press it right down and through. Now we should be able to start lifting up on this to have a peek underneath. To disconnect the electrical connector, you're going to have a locking tab. I'm going to use a flat blade screwdriver. Just press in on it right along here. Lift this up and out of position. A quick inspection for corrosion. We'll set that aside. Let's set that cover aside. Now we can focus along this side here. We're going to start removing our 2 fuel lines. We have the fuel pressure line, which should have a fitting right along here. This just has a rubber hose and a couple clamps, but typically you would want to unscrew the fitting from the line and then set that aside. Before I start with that one though, I always like to go to the return. This one's just held in place with a clamp. That's pretty common on these. We'll use a flathead or whatever size you need. Is probably a 1/4 inch. Slide that down the hose or up the line, whichever way you want to go. We'll remove the hose from this area. Just press it right on off of there. A quick inspection, we can set that aside. Now continuing along here, as I mentioned, you would want to release this fitting. You can do that by using a 14mm wrench. Turn it counterclockwise and separate it. If you have a rubber hose like ours here, you want to confirm that it is fuel rated, of course. Something like this is considered temporary. We're just going to go ahead and get this off of here and continue with our installation. There we are. Once again, we're sliding it off, a quick inspection of the hose, and we'll set it aside. To start removing the mid pipe from the down pipe and flex pipe here, we want to make our way to the joint directly in the center. It's a good idea to have a gasket or a gasket maker for this, because once we separate it, you need to go ahead and clean it, and then of course install some sort of sealant. Our hardware, I'll be using a 12mm on both sides here. Use a wrench. I can use my ratchet on the back side. Inspect your mounting hardware as you remove it. We'll replace things as necessary. There we are. Let's make our way all the way to the back. All the way along the back side here, we have the mounting points for that muffler. If you wanted to, you could remove the entire bracket which holds this in place. There's going to be 2 bolts for each of these. If you don't feel like removing bolts because possibly they're rotted or damaged in some way, continue on to removing the rubber mounting point from each one of these mounting points which are attached to the exhaust. To remove these, you could use a pry bar of some sort or even some pliers and just give it a little squeeze, trying to slide it off and out of position. With all that dislodged, there's still 2 more mounting points we'll have to pay attention to, but for these, we're just going to lower the exhaust enough that we can continually slide it rearward to pull it out of its mounting points. There's one right along the forward aspect of the muffler, and if you were to follow the exhaust pipe forward, you're going to find another one. Continuing from here, it's going to be easiest having a second person. We have to have somebody along the back side and somebody along the front. We don't want anybody getting hurt. Take hold of the pipe and we'll start pulling this straight rearward. There's 2 areas that we want to slide it out of. We'll just have to work it out of position if necessary. There we are. Continuing the removal process for the fuel tank, you can see the sway bar makes its way just underneath the rearward aspect of the fuel tank. It's a good idea to have this out of the way. To be able to dislodge it, you want to pay attention along each side of the sway bar. We'll be looking for the sway bar bushings. Dislodge the sway bar bushing bracket using a 12mm. You'll find 2 bolts on each side of the vehicle. This one out of here as well. Quick inspection of our bracket. Same thing on the other side of the vehicle. This one off of here. Now you should be able to take hold of the sway bar and maneuver it around as necessary. We'll just swing this towards the tank and bring it down and out of the way. Continuing from there, we have to dislodge our emergency brake cables from their mounting points. Just next to one of your control arms, you're going to find one mounting point. This is held in place with a 10mm bolt. We can remove this. There's one bolt. A quick inspection of the mounting bracket. Follow the cable towards the front. In this area, you're going to find a 10mm headed mounting nut attached to a stud. Ours is completely rotted, but typically you want to go ahead and take this off of here so you can dislodge the cable from here as well, giving yourself plenty of area in between the body of the vehicle and the fuel tank. Once you've completed one side of the vehicle, do the exact same thing on the opposite side of the vehicle, emergency brake cable. Now we're going to be opening up the fuel system, so we need to make sure if we're in an enclosed area, it's still well ventilated. You can hear my fan running. We'll continue on along the back side of the fuel tank. In this area, you can see the fuel inlet hose leading in, and up just above that, towards the center of the vehicle, you can see where our vent hose is. Both of these lead to the filler neck. Now we can start removing the inlet hose down to the tank. We have an 8mm headed clamp. Your size may vary. We've got the hose clamp disconnected. We'll just slide that out of the way. You can slide it one direction or the other. We'll continue on with a large hose pick if necessary. We want to get in between the hose and the filler tube on the fuel tank itself, assuming it's stuck in position. Now we'll gently start prying this one out of position as well. Once again, just a quick squeeze, make sure it's soft and pliable, not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. We'll just remove that clamp, a quick inspection. If it looks like it's rotted or weak, go ahead and replace it. With those hoses disconnected, there's still one more hose that we need to pay attention to, and that's along the top rear of the fuel tank here. It's a little bit difficult to see. We want to disconnect the hose from the line which leads to the tank. It's actually part of the tank. On this application, I'll be using a 1/4 inch to loosen this clamp and slide it out of the way so we can remove the hose. Now I'll be using another small pick for this. Just make our way in between so we can separate that. The next thing we'll have to do is apply support underneath the fuel tank so we can start removing each of our 2 fuel straps to be able to lower the fuel tank down. With support under the fuel tank, we can start removing our 2 fuel tank straps. Starting along the back side of each of them, you're going to find a 14mm headed mounting bolt. Do not remove any of these straps until you definitely have support underneath the fuel tank. Let's do the same for the other fuel tank strap and we can make our way up to the front. Continue on to taking hold of the fuel strap from along the backside and roll it down along towards the front. At this point, if you wanted to, you could continue removing the entire strap from the area. You don't necessarily have to, just go ahead and flex it down and out of the way. Repeat the process on the opposite side of the car. Now we can start lowering the fuel tank down slowly. We're going to take our time with this, paying attention to a few things. We have our hoses that we had dislodged from along the backside of the tank. We don't want to get caught on anything. Let's keep on going down a little bit. Okay, hold on one second. We're paying attention to that sway bar. As you can tell, it goes along the lip of the fuel tank here. You can just flex this a little bit as necessary. You could even use a pry bar if needed. Go ahead and go down a little bit more here. This is looking great. A little bit further. Okay, let's pause here. Over on the bench, we can start removing several things from along the tank so we can eventually transfer them over to the brand new tank. We'll start with this hose that makes its way all the way across, connected to a tube leading towards the rear. Our clamp is a 1/4 inch clamp. You can also use a flathead for this. We'll continue on to loosening this up just enough that we can remove the hose from the fuel tank. Sometimes you can grab hold of this with your hand, other times you can just pry it out of place with a small prying device. I'm using a trim tool, slides right over it fairly easily. We'll give it a quick squeeze, make sure it's soft and pliable. Moving along, we have a 10mm headed bolt holding this bracket to the tank. Let's get this off of here. We'll continue following this all the way along the backside now. We've got another 10mm headed mounting bolt. There's that one. Set this aside. Continuing along the top of the tank, you should have several rubber insulators. These rubber insulators need to be in the exact same positioning when you go to install the brand new tank. Sometimes the insulators will be stuck to the tank itself. Other times you might find that you have an area that looks like it had an insulator, but more than likely it's still stuck to the body of the vehicle. You'd want to go ahead and remove them from the fuel tank and reinstall them in the same areas, and then confirm on the vehicle that you still have the insulators where they need to be there as well. I'm going to continue on with my small prying device for this. You can use a trim tool, flathead screwdriver, whatever you need. As I'm removing these from the fuel tank itself, I'm going to mark the fuel tank so I can remember exactly where each one of these needs to go for the installation process. Let's get this out of place. We'll remove the mounting hardware holding it down. I'm using a Phillips head screwdriver. As we continue lifting this up, keep in mind there could still be fuel in this area depending on the level of the fuel inside the tank. We don't want anything making its way out and potentially getting in your eyes or on your hands. Start lifting this up and out of here. We're paying attention to where our level sensor is here, the float, and we also have our strainer down along the bottom. We'll set this aside in a collection receptacle. With that out of the way, we're going to transfer over as much fuel from inside the original fuel tank as possible. I have a transfer unit, so I'm going to remove this and then we'll reinstall it into the brand new tank after the installation. Now it's time to install the fuel pump assembly inside of our brand new fuel tank. When bringing this in, we need to make sure we have our gasket in place, of course. We want to have that in between the fuel tank and the fuel pump assembly. We'll take this and start bringing it in at an angle and line everything up. You can see the gasket protruding up in 3 different areas here. Those are just the alignment tabs. As you move things around, you want to confirm that the gasket has not been dislodged. It can't be sticking out or even worse, into the tank in an area that you can't tell that it's not sealed properly. After confirming everything's properly aligned, continue on with all of your mounting bolts. We'll start them in. After that, snug them up. This is our last one. For good measure, we'll just go around one more time. We definitely do not want to have a leak in this area. With that fully secured, we can continue on with the rest of the items across the top of the tank that we need to install on the new fuel tank. We had that tube that made its way from along the forward aspect of the fuel tank along towards the back. On the forward aspect, we had that rubber hose. This is going to slide right down onto the fuel tank. We'll press it down as far as possible. Before we install the clamp, we'll continue on with each of our brackets, making their way across the fuel tank. Start in the mounting bolts, snug them up. We'll just check this one as well. Confirm everything's properly secured across the top of the tank. Continuing from there, we have our rubber mounts here. I've already marked the tank in the exact positions where I had removed the originals. So we'll just go ahead and slide this into position. I'm going to use some gasket maker to temporarily hold it on there. Once we have the tank up against the body of the vehicle, it's not going to be able to go anywhere anyway. One last quick inspection across the top of our brand new fuel tank, and we can get this back over to the vehicle. Let's start installing our brand new fuel tank in the vehicle. Now, while holding light pressure of the tank up against the body of the vehicle, we can continue on with our two fuel tank straps. Swing the strap up into the proper position here. Now we're going to install our 14mm headed mounting bolt. Make sure you have your washer in there. That's going to help hold it in place securely. Okay, we've got one of the straps started in there. We're going to go over and do the exact same thing for the other fuel tank strap. Once both of them are fully mounted, we can snug them up. Let's tighten them up. Let's remove the support from underneath the fuel tank. With both the straps started, we're going to continue on to taking the fuel tank and push it as far forward as possible. At this point, we should be able to reach up in this area. We're going to take the sway bar and swing it up and inside in between this and the fuel tank itself. Now we can continue on with our fuel hoses across the back of the fuel tank. We'll start with the center one. A quick note about this is you want to make sure you're on the forward side of the fuel tank strap. If you go along the back side, closest along the back of the vehicle, it's not going to be long enough to be able to reach to the proper position. Slide it as far as you can until it bottoms out against its location point. Once it's bottomed out, go ahead and resecure it with the clamp. Whenever you install any fuel hoses with a clamp of some sort, you want to make sure you can see hose on both sides of the clamp. Give it a little tug, make sure it's properly secure. We'll continue on to the next two fuel hoses along the back side here. Now that we finished that hose, we'll make our way to the other two hoses leading off towards the driver's side. Gonna reach up in here, I'll get this aligned, press it onto the fuel tank. Once you have it pressed on there, as you can see, it's pressed on as far as possible. We'll continue on with tightening up the clamp. It needs to be tight. We need to make sure there is no fuel leaks on this vehicle once the job is complete. Once you feel as though you have it tight, give it a quick tug Ensure that it's properly secured and move along to the final hose along this area. We'll get our clamp in place here. I'm just gonna slide it right on over the fuel tank just like before. Now we can take the hose, we'll flex it right on over that. Both my hands are pretty much gonna be up in this area. At this point, we have this pressed on here as far as possible. We're going to make sure we install the clamp in a proper area. To ensure it's in the proper area, it's a good idea to start feeling on the hose. We want to make sure it's nice and stiff exactly where we're putting that clamp. If you can squeeze the hose like I can right here, you're in the wrong placement and it needs to be properly placed. Confirm that this is properly secured. If it's not properly tightened, you could potentially get a fuel leak in this area, and that's a serious safety concern. Now it's time to start resecuring our rear sway bar. Along each side of the vehicle, we need to have the bracket in hand, and we also need to have the mounting bolt. While bringing the bar into the proper position, we want to make sure that the bushing is facing properly as well. You don't want to have it spun in a direction where you won't be able to get the bracket in place. When installing the bracket, we want to make sure that we have this area with the hooked edge facing towards the front of the vehicle. And that hook is going to fit up inside this port. You can see it just behind here. Let's get this in place. Once you've confirmed one side is properly secured, do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Let's move along to resecuring our emergency brake cables. Along the forward aspect, you're going to have a locating tab, and that's going to slide into the port of the body of the vehicle here. We also need to align our mounting bolt holes. Just pivot this right on into place, start in that mounting bolt, snug it up. We'll confirm that this is secured, follow that emergency brake forward. If you had removed the hardware in this area as well, go ahead and reinstall it. Ours was rotted, we did not bother removing it. Repeat the process on the other side of the vehicle. With the e-brake cables properly secured, we're going to focus on reattaching our exhaust. Several areas to pay attention to before we bring the exhaust into place is all of the rubber hangers that you have. Just go ahead and give them a quick wipe. Make sure they're not cracked or damaged in any way. We've got two along the back. You would have one in front of where the muffler would be. In the center of the vehicle, you have that one for the mid-pipe. And we can move forward from there, and we're going to talk about cleaning up the exhaust pipe and preparing it for installation of the other exhaust pipe. When cleaning this area, we want to pay attention for any existing gasket that would be in this place. Sometimes you'll have a gasket that's circular that fits right inside this groove. Other times I've seen it where you're going to have a paper-like gasket that makes its way all the way around this area. And then lastly, you could also just have some sort of sealant as a gasket. Whatever your vehicle has, clean it out of there. To clean this out of here, we're going to use a scraper. You could also use sandpaper or even a wire brush, whatever's best for you. With the catalytic converter pipe cleaned, it's time to start cleaning up the mid-pipe flange. We'll use our scraper in this area as well, remove as much as we can so we have a clean surface for remounting this onto the vehicle. Once it's clean, for good measure, we're going to use high temperature sealant along each side of the pipe, right along the flange area here. If you had a gasket as well, go ahead and slide that right on there. We'll make sure we also apply sealant on the catalytic converter flange as well. With our helper, we'll start raising the exhaust into the proper position here. I'm going to start securing it along the back side. We need to be able to slide the exhaust forward, slide it into the rubbers here. As we're sliding it in, we'll move along to the next one. We don't want to go too far on just one of them. Try to pull it. Slide that right on there. At this point, we can continue sliding this rearward a little bit. We're moving just in front of the muffler now. Paying attention in this area. We need to be able to swing this over this, so we'll have to pull the exhaust rearward a little bit further. We'll flex things as necessary, lift it up into the proper position. A little pry bar will slide it on there fairly easily. Let's continue forward. Now right up here we have our final mounting point before we get to that catalytic converter. We can slide it right in. And now we're at the joint here. At this point we'll continue on to trying to install the mounting hardware here. You don't want to tighten either of these mounting bolts until you have both of them started on and everything properly aligned. All right, let's snug it up. Just double check everything. We want to make sure we're properly secured. You do not want to have an exhaust leak. Now we can start reconnecting our fuel lines and our electrical connector. For this line right here, it typically has a fitting on it which will screw into another fuel line which leads down to the engine eventually. In our application, somebody cut this, so I'm going to be using what I have. If your application still has the fitting set up, you want to go ahead and use your wrenches and make sure it's nice and tight. Since mine does not have the fitting set up, I'm going to continue on with 2 clamps and we'll make sure those are tight. As you continue on, make sure each one of these lines is completely secured, otherwise you're going to have a fuel leak along the top of the fuel tank here, and that can be very dangerous. We've got our next hose here. Slide this into position. Get the clamp so it's showing hose on both sides, of course. Tighten this up. Now that we've confirmed both of those lines are properly secured in place, it's time for our electrical connector and our protective panel. Let's get this electrical connector in place. The locking tab faces towards the passenger side of the vehicle. press it down, give it a light tug, make sure it's properly secured. We can continue on with our plate. I'm going to spin this around so everything's properly aligned. We'll give the rubber grommet a light tug up and through the port. Start in all 3 of your Phillips head screws and snug them up. Reinstall your rubber grommet. It's important to make sure you have a good seal in this area so no moisture or debris makes its way up inside your passenger compartment. Once you've confirmed everything's properly secured here, we can continue on with reinstalling the lower rear seat. When installing the rear seat, we want to ensure that we have access to all 3 of our seatbelt buckles. We never want to have a passenger inside of the vehicle if they can't be buckled up properly. Slide the rear in as far as you can, and we'll continue along the front. Along the front, we need to make sure that we press the seat down into the fully locked position. The next thing you're going to want to do is add fuel inside the filler neck here. Go ahead and top off the tank. Ensure you have no fuel leaks. Reinstall your fuel cap. Close the door. Let's make our way up under the hood. It's time to reconnect our negative battery terminal. We'll press this right on here as far as possible. Use our 12mm. Make sure it's nice and tight. Okay friend, we finished our installation. At this point, go ahead and start up the vehicle. When you attempt to start it, you may find a long crank scenario. That's due to the fact that the fuel pump has to push fuel all the way back up to the fuel rail located at the engine. Once the vehicle is started, triple check for leaks, take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.